The morning sun peeked through the blinds as Dr. James Richardson carefully placed the last of his neatly folded shirts into their shared suitcase. At 76, his movements were slower than they once were, but he still carried himself with the same dignity that had guided him through decades as one of the country's most respected neurosurgeons. "Evelyn, have you seen my blue tie? The one with the small pattern," he called out to his wife of 45 years. Evelyn Richardson appeared in the doorway, already dressed in an elegant navy blue pantsuit that complemented her silver hair, which was pulled back in a classic bun. At 74, she still had the commanding presence that had served her well during her years as a university dean. "It's already packed, dear." "Along with your cufflinks," she replied with a smile. "You know I wouldn't let you forget those." Today was special. After decades of putting others first, his patients, her students, their community in Atlanta, they were finally taking the trip they had always talked about but never found time for. First-class tickets to Paris, a suite at a historic hotel overlooking the Seine, and 2 weeks of nothing but art, food, and each other's company. "Can you believe we're finally doing this?" Evelyn said, sitting down beside the suitcase. "All those years we talked about seeing the Louvre together." James sat beside her, taking her hand in his. Their fingers intertwined naturally, the way they had for nearly half a century. "Better late than never," he said with a gentle squeeze. The couple had met at Howard University in the 1970s. He was a medical student, she was pursuing her doctorate in education. Their relationship had blossomed against the backdrop of the civil rights movement's later years. They had marched together, dreamed together, and built a life that defied the limitations others tried to place on them. "Remember when we could barely afford bus tickets across town?" James chuckled. "Now look at us, first class to Paris." "We've earned it," Evelyn said firmly. "Every bit of it." And they had. Dr. Richardson had pioneered surgical techniques that had saved countless lives, often working extra hours to treat patients who couldn't afford care. Evelyn had transformed her university's education department, creating scholarship programs that had helped hundreds of underprivileged students. Together, they had established a foundation that provided medical and educational resources to underserved communities. Their driver arrived precisely at 9 a.m. The couple had always valued punctuality, a trait they'd passed on to their 2 adult children, both successful professionals themselves. At the airport, they moved unhurriedly through the premium check-in line. The airline staff greeted them warmly, offering congratulations when they mentioned it was their anniversary trip. 45 years, the check-in agent said with genuine admiration. "That's something to celebrate." The exclusive first-class lounge welcomed them with comfortable seating and a quiet atmosphere. James sipped a cup of coffee while Evelyn leafed through a travel guide, occasionally reading interesting facts about Parisian landmarks aloud. "Did you know the Eiffel Tower was supposed to be temporary?" she asked, adjusting her reading glasses. "Just like our first apartment," James replied with a wink, referring to the tiny place they'd rented as newlyweds, planning to stay only a year but remaining for nearly 5. When boarding time came, they gathered their carry-on items, her tote bag containing a novel she'd been saving for the flight, his leather satchel holding his reading glasses and crossword puzzles. They had always been planners, leaving nothing to chance. Walking down the jetway toward the plane, Evelyn linked her arm through her husband's. "Here's to new adventures," she whispered. "With my favorite travel companion," he replied. They had no way of knowing that their carefully planned anniversary trip was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would test their dignity and resolve in ways they hadn't faced in years. But for now, as they approached the aircraft door, they were simply a distinguished couple embarking on a well-deserved holiday, their hearts light with anticipation and their minds filled with dreams of Parisian streets. The Richardsons stepped onto the plane, the excitement of their anniversary trip visible in their eyes. The first-class cabin gleamed with soft lighting and plush leather seats. Several passengers were already settling in, placing bags in overhead compartments and accepting welcome drinks from smiling flight attendants. "Seats 2A and 2B," James said quietly to Evelyn as they made their way down the aisle. Their seats were positioned by the window, Evelyn's preference, as she loved watching the clouds during takeoff. As they reached their row, James stepped aside to let his wife in first. He had always been a gentleman that way, a small courtesy from their courtship days that had never faded. Evelyn slid gracefully into her window seat while James placed their small carry-on bags in the overhead bin. A flight attendant with a blonde ponytail and crisp uniform approached them just as James was about to sit down. Her name tag read Melissa Granger. Unlike the warm smiles she had offered to other first-class passengers, her expression tightened as she looked at the elderly couple. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a sharpness that made nearby passengers glance up. "I think you may be in the wrong section." James turned to her with a polite smile. "No, these are our seats, 2A and 2B. Melissa's eyes narrowed slightly. Without even checking their boarding passes, she replied, "First class is fully booked today. Your seats must be further back." Evelyn looked up, surprise crossing her face. She had been arranging her reading materials in the seat pocket. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said calmly. "We have first-class tickets." A few nearby passengers watched the exchange with growing discomfort. An older white gentleman across the aisle frowned slightly at the scene unfolding. James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out their boarding passes. "Here you are," he said, his voice still kind but firm. He had dealt with these assumptions before, too many times over the decades. Melissa reluctantly took the boarding passes, examining them with obvious skepticism. Her lips pressed together as she saw the clear first-class designation and their assigned seats. "There must have been an upgrade error in the system," she muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "These tickets were probably economy tickets that got upgraded by mistake." A businessman sitting in the row behind them shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Our travel agent booked these seats 3 months ago," Evelyn explained gently. "We specifically chose these for our anniversary trip." Another flight attendant, a tall man with a friendly face, passed by and noticed the conversation. He glanced at the boarding passes still in Melissa's hand. "Is everything all right here?" he asked. Before Melissa could respond, James spoke up. "Just a small misunderstanding about our seats, but I believe it's cleared up now." His dignity never wavered, though the situation was all too familiar. The male flight attendant, his name tag read Robert, gave a warm smile. "Well, happy anniversary to you both. Can I get you some champagne to start your celebration?" "That would be lovely," Evelyn replied. Melissa handed back their boarding passes with a tight nod and no apology. "Fine. These appear to be correct." She moved away quickly to assist other passengers, though assist didn't quite describe her attentive fawning over the white couple seated in the first row. James settled into his seat finally, exchanging a look with his wife that spoke volumes, a look perfected over 45 years of marriage. It said, "We've been here before. We won't let it ruin our day." "Paris awaits," he whispered to her, taking her hand. Evelyn squeezed his hand in return. "Yes, it does," she replied softly. Robert returned with 2 glasses of champagne on a small tray. "Here you are, Dr. and Mrs. Richardson. First of many toasts on your special trip." As they clinked glasses, Evelyn noticed Melissa at the front of the cabin, watching them with obvious disapproval. But decades of facing subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination had taught the Richardsons to rise above such treatment. "To 45 years," James said, focusing entirely on his wife. "And many more," Evelyn replied. They sipped their champagne as the remaining passengers boarded the plane. The couple settled in, determined to enjoy their well-deserved luxury. But the tension in the air suggested that Melissa's behavior was far from over, and the 5-hour flight to Paris was just beginning. The seatbelt sign dinged off about 20 minutes after takeoff. The plane had reached its cruising altitude, and the first-class cabin settled into a peaceful rhythm. Soft conversations hummed between passengers, while others already dozed off beneath plush blankets. Outside the window, the clouds formed a perfect white carpet beneath them. Evelyn gently closed her novel and placed it on her lap. "I think I'd like some water," she said to James, who was working on the crossword puzzle he brought along. "I'll get the attention of one of the flight attendants," he replied, looking up from his newspaper. But there was no need. Melissa was already making her way down the aisle, pushing a cart with pre-meal drinks. She stopped at the first row, smiling brightly at the businessman in 1A. "Would you care for a beverage before lunch, sir?" she asked warmly. "We have a lovely selection of wines, or perhaps a cocktail." The man ordered a scotch on the rocks, which Melissa prepared with careful attention, adding precisely 2 ice cubes and a small cocktail napkin embossed with the airline's logo. She then moved to the couple seated across the aisle, offering them the same cheerful service. One by one, she served each passenger in the first-class cabin with attentive care. A gin and tonic for the woman in 3B, a glass of Chardonnay for the gentleman in 4C. Each drink came with a smile, a napkin, and often a small bowl of warmed nuts. The Richardsons waited patiently, watching as Melissa worked her way through the cabin. When she reached the row directly in front of them, she spent extra time chatting with a young white couple about their honeymoon plans. "Venice is absolutely magical this time of year," she gushed, leaning in conspiratorially. "Be sure to take a sunset gondola ride along the Grand Canal." Finally, after serving every other passenger in first class, Melissa's cart arrived at row 2. She looked directly at the passenger across the aisle from the Richardsons, completely ignoring them. "Something to drink, sir?" she asked the man pleasantly. Actually, the man replied with a slight frown. "I believe these folks have been waiting longer than I have." He nodded toward the Richardsons. Melissa's smile tightened. Without looking at them, she asked flatly, "What would you like?" "Water with lemon for me, please," Evelyn said pleasantly. "And my husband would like—" "You'll need to wait your turn," Melissa interrupted, still not making eye contact. "One drink at a time." The cabin grew noticeably quieter. A woman 3 rows ahead turned to look back at the exchange, her eyebrows raised in surprise. James cleared his throat. "My wife was merely trying to be efficient, as you seem quite busy." "I'd like a tomato juice when convenient." Melissa slung a plastic cup of water, no lemon, no ice, onto Evelyn's tray table, sloshing some over the side. Without acknowledging James' request, she immediately turned to the man across the aisle. "And for you, sir?" "I think I've changed my mind," the man said coolly. "I'm not thirsty anymore." By now, several passengers were openly watching. An older woman whispered something to her husband. A businessman in the front row had put down his laptop to observe the situation. Robert, the other flight attendant who had offered them champagne earlier, returned from the galley with a tray of hot towels. He noticed the tension immediately, and the water spilled on Evelyn's tray. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his eyes quickly assessing the situation. "Just fine," Melissa said curtly, beginning to move her cart forward. "Actually," Evelyn spoke up, her voice calm but clear, "I had asked for water with lemon, and my husband hasn't been served at all." Robert's friendly face showed a flash of confusion, then understanding. "I'll take care of that right away, Mrs. Richardson," he said. He quickly handed James a hot towel and used another to wipe up the spilled water on Evelyn's tray. "Let me bring you both proper drinks. Tomato juice for you, Dr. Richardson." "That would be wonderful, thank you," James replied. As Robert hurried to the galley, the Richardsons noticed several passengers exchanging glances and whispers. The discriminatory treatment was becoming impossible to ignore, even for bystanders. A woman with graying hair and fashionable glasses seated in the row behind them leaned forward slightly. "Excuse me," she said quietly to the Richardsons. "I couldn't help but notice what's happening. I'm an attorney, and what you're experiencing is completely unacceptable." James turned slightly in his seat. "Thank you for your concern," he said with dignity. "Unfortunately, it's not an unfamiliar experience, even after all these years." "Well, it shouldn't be happening on this flight or anywhere else," the woman replied firmly. "I've been watching since boarding, and I've seen enough." The tension in the first-class cabin continued to build as meal service approached. Melissa's behavior had crossed a line that was evident to everyone except Melissa herself, who continued to move through the cabin as if nothing was wrong. The meal service began with the gentle clinking of silverware being unwrapped. The scent of freshly baked bread filled the cabin as Robert moved through the aisle with a basket, offering each passenger their choice. When he reached the Richardsons, he gave them an extra warm smile. "Our chef prepared a special salmon dish today, but we also have a beef option if you prefer," Robert explained, his kind eyes meeting theirs directly, a stark contrast to Melissa's avoidance. "The salmon sounds wonderful," Evelyn said, accepting a warm roll with a nod of thanks. As Robert moved on, Melissa appeared with the drink cart again. This time, she was offering wine pairings with the meal. Once again, she methodically served every passenger except the Richardsons. The attorney behind them had been quietly documenting the ongoing situation on her phone. She wasn't recording video, that would have been too obvious, but she was taking detailed notes with timestamps. Her husband, seated beside her, occasionally whispered something in her ear, his expression concerned. Across the aisle, the businessman who had declined his drink earlier caught James's eye and gave a small nod of solidarity. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from the usual first-class pleasantness to something more alert, more watchful. Melissa returned to the galley and emerged with a tray of plated meals. She served the front rows with professional efficiency, describing each dish with practiced detail. The sauce is a light dill cream, and the vegetables are locally sourced, she explained to one passenger. When she reached the Richardsons, however, she practically dropped their trays on the table without a word of explanation about the meal. Evelyn's salmon was visibly smaller than portions served to other passengers, and unlike the other carefully arranged plates, theirs appeared hastily assembled. "Excuse me," James said politely as Melissa turned to leave. "Could we have some wine with our meal, please?" Melissa barely looked back. "We're out of the white wine that pairs with salmon. I'll check if there's anything else later." The businessman across the aisle spoke up immediately. "That's odd. You just poured me a glass of Chardonnay not 2 minutes ago and mentioned it pairs perfectly with the salmon." Melissa's face flushed slightly. "That was the last of it," she said tersely. Robert had just emerged from the galley in time to overhear. His friendly face showed a flicker of confusion. "We have plenty of the Chardonnay left, Melissa. I just opened another case." He looked at the Richardsons. "Would you both like a glass?" "Yes, thank you," James replied calmly. The attorney behind them cleared her throat. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention without creating a scene. "I'd like to speak with the chief purser, please." Melissa's expression hardened. "Is there a problem with your meal?" "The problem isn't with the meal," the attorney replied evenly. "The problem is with the discriminatory service I've been observing since boarding." A hush fell over the nearby rows. Several passengers looked up from their meals. "I don't know what you're talking about," Melissa said defensively. The businessman across from the Richardsons set down his fork. "I think we all know exactly what she's talking about." Another passenger 2 rows ahead turned around. "I've noticed it too. It's not right." Robert stepped forward, his professional demeanor intact but concern evident in his eyes. "I'll get the chief purser right away," he said quietly, moving toward the front of the plane. Evelyn reached over and placed her hand gently on her husband's. In 45 years of marriage, they had developed an entire language of touches. This one said both, "I'm all right," and "let's stay calm." The attorney leaned forward again. "I'm Beth Goldstein. I specialize in civil rights cases," she said in a low voice to the Richardsons. "What you're experiencing is textbook discrimination." James nodded slightly. "We're aware," he said softly. "But we've learned over the years to pick our battles carefully." "With all due respect, Dr. Richardson," Beth replied, "sometimes the battles pick you. And when they do in such an obvious way, with so many witnesses, it's important to address them, not just for yourselves, but for everyone who might face this treatment without having the resources or support to challenge it." Evelyn turned slightly in her seat. "You're absolutely right," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had seen both progress and setbacks in her lifetime. "There was a time when we would have stayed quiet just to avoid making a scene. But that time has passed." The chief purser, a tall woman with short gray hair and an air of authority, appeared beside their row. "I'm Diane, the flight's chief purser. I understand there's a situation that needs my attention." Before anyone could respond, Melissa rushed over. "These passengers are making a scene and disrupting service," she said quickly. "I've been nothing but professional." Diane held up a hand, silencing her. "I'd like to hear from others, please." She looked around at the nearby passengers, then at the Richardsons. "Would you mind telling me what's happened?" As James began to explain calmly and factually, other passengers chimed in with their observations. The story of Melissa's behavior since boarding emerged piece by piece, creating a clear pattern that was impossible to dismiss. Diane listened carefully as James explained the situation, her expression professional, but her eyes showing clear concern. She occasionally nodded, jotting notes on a small pad she'd pulled from her uniform pocket. When other passengers added their observations, she gave each one her full attention. "So you weren't offered the same welcome drink as others," she clarified, looking at her notes. "You were told you were in the wrong section despite having valid first-class tickets. You were served last or not at all in some cases, and your meal portions appear smaller than others." "That's correct," Evelyn confirmed quietly. Melissa stood nearby, arms crossed defensively over her chest. Her face had gone from flushed to pale as passenger after passenger confirmed what had happened. "It's been blown out of proportion," she insisted, her voice tight. "We've been short-staffed today, and I've been doing my best to serve everyone." The businessman across the aisle shook his head. "That doesn't explain why you served every single person in first class before these folks, or why you claimed we were out of wine when we weren't." Beth, the attorney, spoke up again. "I've been documenting the pattern of treatment since we boarded. This isn't about being short-staffed. This is targeted behavior." Diane turned to Melissa. "I need to speak with you privately. Robert, please take over service for the entire first-class cabin." She gestured toward the galley at the front of the plane. As they walked away, the cabin buzzed with quiet conversation. Several passengers leaned toward the Richardsons, offering supportive comments. "You've handled this with such grace," said an elderly white woman from across the aisle. "I don't know that I would have been so composed." James smiled gently. "Practice," he said simply, though there was a lifetime of experience in that single word. Robert moved through the cabin, refilling wine glasses and offering extra bread. When he reached the Richardsons, he leaned down slightly. "I want to apologize for what you've experienced," he said quietly. "It doesn't represent our airline or what we stand for." "We know that," Evelyn assured him. "You've been wonderful." In the galley, Diane and Melissa could be seen through the partially open curtain. Diane's expression was stern, while Melissa's posture had grown increasingly defensive. Their conversation wasn't audible to the passengers, but the intensity was clear from their body language. Beth leaned forward again. "I hope you don't mind my stepping in," she said to the Richardsons. "My husband thought I was being too forward, but some things you just can't let slide." "We appreciate it," James replied, turning slightly in his seat. "There was a time when no one would have said anything. The fact that so many people noticed and spoke up, that's progress." "Not enough progress," Beth's husband added, "if it's still happening at all." The cabin settled back into a quieter atmosphere as passengers returned to their meals. Robert ensured the Richardsons had proper portions and paired wines, treating them with the same attentive service he showed everyone. About 15 minutes later, Diane emerged from the galley alone. She made her way directly to the Richardsons' row and crouched in the aisle beside them to be at eye level. "Dr. and Mrs. Richardson, I want to personally apologize for your experience today," she said, her voice low but clear. "What happened is completely unacceptable and violates not only our company policies, but my personal standards as chief purser." James nodded, acknowledging her words. "I've spoken with Melissa, and she will not be serving in the first-class cabin for the remainder of this flight. When we land, she'll be meeting with management." Diane's expression was solemn. "Our airline has a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior of any kind." "What will happen to her?" Evelyn asked, her voice showing genuine concern despite everything that had occurred. Diane seemed slightly surprised by the question. "There will be an investigation. Based on what I've gathered and the number of witnesses, it's likely she'll face significant consequences." James and Evelyn exchanged a look, one of those wordless communications developed over decades together. "We don't wish to see anyone lose their livelihood," James said carefully. "Perhaps this could be a learning opportunity rather than simply a punitive measure." Now Diane looked truly surprised. "That's very generous of you, considering how you've been treated." "Punishment without education rarely leads to real change," Evelyn explained softly. "We've seen that throughout our lives." Beth leaned forward again. "I don't mean to intrude, but as someone who handles these cases professionally, I'd be happy to provide a written statement if you decide to file a formal complaint." Diane nodded. "That would be helpful. We take these matters extremely seriously." The chief purser stood up, addressing the Richardsons once more. "For the remainder of the flight, please let me know personally if there's anything you need." I've also taken the liberty of upgrading your return flight to first class at no additional charge." "That's very kind, but not necessary," James replied. "We had already booked first class for the return as well. This is our anniversary trip." "Then we'll be sending a bottle of champagne to your hotel in Paris," Diane said with a warm smile. "At the very least, please allow us to do that much." As Diane moved back to the front of the cabin, the Richardsons continued their meal in peace. The atmosphere had shifted again. The tension dissolved, replaced by something that felt almost like solidarity among the passengers who had witnessed and spoken up about the injustice. The Richardsons' flight touched down in Paris just as the afternoon sun bathed the city in golden light. As they disembarked, Diane stood at the door, personally thanking each passenger. When the Richardsons approached, she handed them a small envelope. "The contact information for our customer relations director," she explained. "He's expecting your call, but only if you wish to discuss the matter further." James accepted the envelope with a nod. "Thank you for handling everything so professionally." Outside the airport, as they waited for their hotel car, Evelyn took her husband's hand. "Well, that wasn't exactly how I imagined starting our anniversary trip." "No," James agreed with a gentle smile, "but at least it ended better than it began." Neither of them had any way of knowing that while they were settling into their hotel room with a view of the Eiffel Tower, Beth Goldstein was drafting a detailed account of what she had witnessed on the flight. Though she didn't include any video recording, only her written observations, her social media post about the incident quickly gained attention. By the following morning, as the Richardsons enjoyed croissants and coffee at a sidewalk cafe, Beth's post had been shared thousands of times. The airline's name was trending, with many users sharing their own experiences of discrimination while traveling. The Richardsons remained blissfully unaware of the growing story. They spent their day visiting the Louvre, marveling at centuries of art and history. James kept his phone switched off, a habit from his days as a surgeon, when truly disconnecting meant handing off responsibilities completely. 3 days into their Paris vacation, they returned to their hotel after an evening at the opera to find a message from the concierge. The airline's CEO had called personally, asking if the Richardsons would be willing to speak with him. "Should we?" Evelyn asked as they rode the elevator to their suite. James considered the question. "I suppose it depends on what he has to say." The next morning, they arranged a call from their hotel room. The CEO, a man named Philip Howard, thanked them for their time before launching into an earnest apology. "What happened on your flight was inexcusable," he said, his voice carrying the weight of sincere regret. "I wanted to speak with you directly to assure you that we're taking this incident very seriously." "We appreciate that," James replied. "Though I must say, it seems to have become a much bigger situation than we anticipated." There was a pause on the line. "You haven't seen the news, have you?" The Richardsons exchanged a glance. "We've been enjoying Paris," Evelyn explained. "We haven't been following any news from home." Philip explained that Beth's account had gone viral, prompting the airline to release a public statement condemning the incident and announcing Melissa's suspension pending investigation. The story had been picked up by several major news outlets, becoming part of a larger conversation about ongoing discrimination in everyday situations. "We've been inundated with similar stories from other passengers," Philip continued. "It's clear that while this incident was particularly egregious, it represents a broader issue we need to address." James leaned forward slightly. "What do you plan to do about it?" "That's partly why I'm calling," Philip replied. "We're developing a more comprehensive diversity training program for all customer-facing staff. But I'm concerned that simply punishing Ms. Granger doesn't address the root problem." Evelyn nodded, though the CEO couldn't see her. "That's exactly what we said to Diane during the flight." "Ms. Granger has been placed on administrative leave," Philip explained. "She's issued a written apology, though I understand if you're skeptical about its sincerity." "May I ask what she said?" James inquired. Philip read from Melissa's statement, which acknowledged her behavior was unacceptable and discriminatory. She claimed to be deeply ashamed and asked for an opportunity to learn from this mistake. When he finished reading, the line was quiet for a moment. "Do you think she means it?" Evelyn finally asked. Philip sighed. "I can't say for certain. People often say the right things when their job is on the line." What I do know is that firing her and moving on doesn't solve the deeper issue. James took his wife's hand, another silent communication passing between them before he spoke. We've spent our careers trying to open doors rather than close them. If Ms. Granger is genuinely interested in learning and changing, perhaps this could become something positive. What are you suggesting? Philip asked. Instead of simply firing her, create a meaningful consequence that leads to education and growth, James suggested. People rarely change when they're simply punished. They change when they understand the impact of their actions and are given tools to do better. By the time the call ended, the outlines of a plan had formed. The airline would develop an enhanced training program addressing unconscious bias and discrimination with input from civil rights organizations. And rather than immediately terminating Melissa, they would offer her a choice: participate fully in this program and demonstrate genuine change, or resign. As the Richardsons returned to exploring Paris, they had no idea that their measured response to discrimination would itself become part of the viral story, an example of grace and wisdom in the face of prejudice. 6 months had passed since the Richardsons' eventful flight to Paris. Their anniversary trip had been everything they'd hoped for: 14 days of art, history, food, and each other's company. The incident with Melissa had faded from their immediate thoughts, though they occasionally discussed it over dinner, wondering what had come of the airline's promises. On a crisp autumn morning, James retrieved the mail, shuffling through bills and advertisements until he paused at an envelope bearing the airline's logo. Inside was a formal invitation from Philip Howard, the CEO, requesting the Richardsons' presence at the launch of their new diversity training program. "They're actually doing it," Evelyn said with surprise when James showed her the letter. "I wonder if it's any good." "Only one way to find out," James replied. The airline had offered to fly them first class to their headquarters in Atlanta, where the program would be unveiled to staff and press. After some discussion, the Richardsons decided to accept. 2 weeks later, they found themselves in a modern conference room at the airline's training center. About 30 people were gathered: flight attendants, pilots, gate agents, and other staff, all wearing name tags and carrying folders with the program title, Beyond Awareness, Creating True Inclusion. Philip greeted them warmly at the door. "Dr. and Mrs. Richardson, I can't thank you enough for coming. Your input has been invaluable in developing this program. We're curious to see what you've created," James said, shaking the CEO's hand. As they took seats near the front, Evelyn whispered to her husband, "Do you think she'll be here?" James scanned the room. "I don't know. Would you want her to be?" Before Evelyn could answer, Philip stepped to the podium and welcomed everyone. He spoke about the airline's commitment to creating an inclusive environment for both passengers and employees, acknowledging that they had fallen short of that goal too many times. "Real change requires more than just words," he said. "It requires honest self-reflection, education, and a willingness to learn from our mistakes." He introduced the diversity consultant who had helped develop the program, a respected professor from Howard University, the Richardsons' alma mater. As the professor outlined the comprehensive 6-week training all customer-facing staff would undergo, James nodded approvingly at the thorough approach. Then Philip said something that caught the Richardsons by surprise. "We have someone here today who has already completed this program. Her journey over the past 6 months has been difficult but transformative." He paused. "I'd like to invite Melissa Granger to share her experience." There was a murmur in the room as Melissa stood up from a seat in the back corner. She looked different, not just in her civilian clothes instead of a uniform, but in her demeanor. The defensive posture was gone, replaced by something more open, though undeniably nervous. As she walked to the podium, her eyes briefly met the Richardsons. There was a flash of recognition, followed by visible shame. She looked down quickly, arranging her notes with shaking hands. "Good morning," she began, her voice quiet but steady. 6 months ago, I was suspended from my position as a flight attendant after treating passengers, specifically Dr. and Mrs. Richardson, in a discriminatory manner." She took a deep breath. "At first, I was angry about being reported. I made excuses. I told myself I was just having a bad day, that people were overreacting, that I wasn't really racist because I had black friends." Melissa looked up, addressing the room directly now. It took weeks of honest conversations and hard self-reflection to recognize the truth. My actions were discriminatory. They came from unconscious biases I'd never confronted and assumptions I didn't even realize I was making. She described the intensive program she'd completed, the workshops, the one-on-one coaching, the reading, and most impactfully, the listening sessions with passengers from various backgrounds who had experienced discrimination while traveling. The hardest part wasn't learning about bias, she admitted. It was facing the reality that my actions had caused real hurt to real people. People who had done nothing wrong, who were simply trying to enjoy a service they had paid for, just like any other customer. As she spoke, her gaze returned to the Richardsons. Dr. and Mrs. Richardson, I don't know if you can ever forgive my behavior that day. I wouldn't blame you if you couldn't. But I want you to know that because of you, because you advocated for education rather than simply punishment, I've changed. Not just how I act at work, but how I see the world. The room was silent when she finished. Philip returned to the podium and thanked her for her honesty, then invited the Richardsons to say a few words if they wished. James and Evelyn exchanged a look, one of their silent conversations that had served them well for 45 years. Then they both stood and made their way to the front of the room. James spoke first. Throughout our careers, mine in medicine, my wife's in education, we've believed in the power of growth and transformation. What we've heard today confirms that belief. Evelyn nodded. Change doesn't happen through shame or punishment alone. It happens through understanding, through seeing each other's full humanity. She looked directly at Melissa. We accept your apology and we commend your courage in doing this difficult work. As the formal presentation ended and people began to mingle, Melissa approached the Richardsons privately. Thank you, she said simply, her eyes brimming with tears. You had every right to demand I be fired. Instead, you gave me a chance to become better. Make the most of it, James replied kindly. Not just for yourself, but for everyone you encounter from now on.